Okay, so my chapter is chapter 3, second and written language acquisition. So there is a theory that says that language is acquired. Children acquire their first language and can acquire two or three more if they are exposed to different languages. They do this rapidly without formal instruction. Some researchers argue that second and written languages are acquired in the same way that oral language is acquired through receiving comprehensible input. And I put a little picture of a frog to show that they're not receiving comprehensible input. Comprehensible input means that they're receiving language, they're receiving something that they can comprehend. Second language acquisition. First language acquisition is almost universal in many parts of the world, so they acquire it similarly, the first language that they're acquiring. In other parts of the world, second and third language acquisition is common. US questions whether second languages can be acquired. An example of this older emergent bilinguals that often struggle to develop the same English proficiency as native speakers, like the pronunciation. Percentages of people who are bilingual in the US went from 6% in 1976 to 80% in 2000. More than half of the world's population is bilingual. This suggests that under the right circumstances, school-aged children and adults can acquire a second or third language. So basically, in other countries, there are more people that are bilingual than in the US. Again, because the US has doubts on whether it's possible to attain this. Written language acquisition. There are clear differences between oral and written languages. Written language is more lexically dense than oral language. Oral language is more grammatically complex than written language. Oral languages are considered natural since they result from innate or cognitive capacity. All humans develop oral or sign language unless they have serious neurological impairments or are brought up under unusual conditions. Written language is a secondary system that represents oral language in some ways. Written languages are created by people and cannot be said to reflect an innate capacity. Not all humans develop literacy, so whether written language can be acquired is debatable. Insights from linguistics suggest that both second and written languages may be acquired rather than learned. So again, they're saying like oral language there is more innate, like we just have the capacity to, but then written language was created by people. It's systems that were created by people, so not all people develop literacy. And again, this is important because we're going to see the different theories, whether it's learned, taught systematically, or it's acquired more naturally, the way that we acquire language. Two views of second or foreign language acquisition. Two views on how people develop a second language, acquired versus learned. Traditional methods of second language learning believe second language is learned. Those are the more traditional methods. Second views suggest second language can be acquired in the same way that a first language is acquired. Traditional language teaching practices prevail in many classrooms. Current linguistic theories support methods based on acquisition view. So what we see more in the class is like a systematic one, which is the learned one. Okay, let me try to not block with my face. The goal is to produce students who speak and understand the language. We have the goals and the methods for learning view and for acquisition view. The goal is to produce students who speak and understand the language, best accomplished by teaching each part of the language, pronunciation, grammar, and vocabulary. Direct and systematic. An example of this could be for early lessons to all be in present tense and to teach that part of the language. Students must learn the new language before they can study contents, subjects in the new language. On acquisition view, the goal is to enable students to use the language for a variety of academic purposes. So you see the difference over here, it's like use. It's more like student-centered. They're the ones applying it. Students should be able to understand, speak, read, and write the language in different subject areas. To accomplish this goal, teachers provide students with a great deal of language input and use various techniques to make the new language comprehensible, such as gestures, pictures, realia, books that include a predictable pattern, and clear pictures of keywords. Students learn language as they engage in activities that involve them in the content. So the learn one was first you have to learn the language, then I can teach you content in that language, but the acquisitions is like you're learning content, estás aprendiendo matemáticas mientras a la vez estás aprendiendo el idioma del inglés, right? Okay, classroom activities against further learning and the acquisition view. Oral drills and written exercises translate passages from the target languages to their native language and vice versa. Learn dialogues and practice them in pairs or small groups. Each drill, exercise, or dialogue would reinforce grammar and vocabulary the students are learning. For the acquisition view, students often work in pairs or small groups. Instruction is scaffolded in various ways to make the language of the content comprehensible. An example might include working in pairs using different resources to compare and contrast herbivores and carnivores. Learn academic content as they develop their second language. At first, rely heavily on context clues to make sense of instruction. Gradually, they build up their ability to participate in lesson on different subjects. Also learn language for social purposes. So the learning view has to do more with drill. The acquisition is as you're learning a certain subject, you're learning a language too, a second language. Attitude toward the errors. On the learning view, emphasis is on developing correct language forms. Teachers correct errors immediately and often directly. This helps students to avoid developing bad habits of grammar or pronunciation. Much of the class focuses on producing the correct language forms. For the acquisition view, all students make errors. If their intent is to express their ideas, they will modify their language to make it more understandable to their listeners or readers. Teachers help students say what they want to say. Teachers give them strategies so they can continue to communicate when they don't have linguistic resources. An example of this may be giving sentence frames to help students express complex ideas. The color is, the shape is. The students can use these as scaffold in their speaking and writing. So over here we see where they use more scaffolding. Ways to not give them directly the answer, but kind of give them a little push to the answer. Okay, orientations toward language teaching. Orientation is a set of assumptions about language and learning that guide teacher practice. Two older orientations include grammar-based and communicative. More current ones, empiricist and rationalist. So they guide how we grammar-based orientation. Founded on faculty psychology and traditional grammar. Faculty psychology held that different kinds of knowledge were located in different parts of the brain. It was important to exercise the different parts of the brain. Learning a language means learning grammar and the vocabulary. Learning expands one's intellect. Learning a foreign language enables one to translate great works of literature. Learning the grammar of a foreign language helps one learn the grammar of one's own language. The goal was to learn grammar and vocabulary of a language to translate literature into their home language. So like the name, it focused more on grammar. You have the communicative orientation. Goal was to communicate with speakers of a language rather than to translate, based on the idea that a classroom should focus on providing intense interaction in the second language. The native language should not be included in the classroom. Students make their direct associations between the target language and meaning. Language is primarily speech, but reading and writing should be taught from the beginning. Purpose of language learning is communication. Learning a language involves learning about the culture. It gave rise to the direct method in which no translation is allowed. Cummins and Garcia argue that language acquisition and bilingualism are promoted by the use of both a first and second language. So this one didn't advocate for using the first language, but then we have other theories, Cummins and Garcia, which we've seen in past biliteracy courses, and how they They talk about translanguaging, how the first language should be included in the bilingual instruction. Empiricist orientation. Based on behavioral psychology and structural linguistics, language is speech, not writing. Language is a set of habits. Teach the language, not about the language. A language is what native speakers say, not what someone thinks they ought to say. And languages are different. The rationalist orientation. Most current methods of second and foreign language teaching are based on this orientation. Assumptions of this orientation include a living language is characterized by rule-governed creativity. The rules of grammar are psychologically real. People are specially equipped to learn language. A living language is a language in which we can think. Methods based on this orientation include the silent way, community language learning, and problem posing. We're going to see more of those methods. So methods based on the rationalist orientation. Silent way. Students are held responsible for their own learning and teachers, for the most part, silent, like the title. Teacher model an expression only once, and students must work to reproduce it. Can work with the Cuisenaire rods to represent words, morpheme sounds, and so on. Students can develop language by taking responsibility for their learning rather than by being taught rules. Community language. Teacher facilitate interaction among students in the same way a counselor would guide a counseling group. Teachers help translate what the students want to say into the language that they are learning. Conversation among students are taped and then used as a text for learning. Problem posing, developed by Freire to teach literacy to adults and has been adapted to teach a second language. Teacher listens to students and finds out their concerns and problems. Teacher poses a problem termed a code. Code could be a song, poem, or picture. Students discuss the problems and ways to solve it. The goal is to equip students with the language needed to discuss their problem and find a solution. So those are based on the rationalist orientation, activities that they would do to promote the developing of a language. Other methods based on the rationalist orientation. The total physical response. I love this one. I do this one with my kids. People learn better when they respond with their bodies. Teacher gives commands and students respond by acting out the command. Lessons include a series of related commands, dialogues, roleplay, and storytelling. TPR has been used with beginning level students as a technique rather than a complete method. So they don't really count it as a complete method. I mean, I use it for vocabulary words in the Spanish language arts. So I give them a word, I give them the meaning. Now, in a group, come up with an action to represent the definition. And I also use it in English because the majority of my learners are ELOs. So, okay, I give them the same thing, a word, a definition, try to act it out, but as a group. So there'll be like this year I have native English speakers, so at least one of those in each group that can help with that and how to create the action. But I just think it's a very interactive way where they're reflecting and they're moving and other people are getting to visualize, and I really like it. But it's not like a complete method here. They're saying it's more like a technique. The natural approach focuses on techniques to make the input comprehensible. Examples include the teacher using gestures, pictures, or real objects to convey meaning in second language. Students move through stages from pre-production to intermediate fluency. Each stage, different techniques used. So techniques are changing as the levels of the kids are changing. Has been modified to include more focus on academic content rather than basic everyday language. Okay. Then we have the cognitive academic language learning approach and the structured observation protocol, or the acronym for it, SIOP. The cognitive academic language learning approach was designed specifically to teach academic content to older students who had developed social communicative skills in English or academic content knowledge and literacy in their first language and some English. So they had some knowledge in English, either the social or they were very good in their native language and had somewhat understanding in English. Three components include grade appropriate content, academic language development, and instruction and learning strategies. Emphasizes students' cognitive academic language and development, focuses on acquiring language in the process of studying academic content. And I think that's what we do basically with the 50-50 model, the Gomez and Gomez that we have. It's like certain subjects are taught just in a certain language to be able to be obtaining that certain content, but also the language. The SIOP, wisely used for teaching emergent bilinguals both language and academic subject matter content. 8 components: the lesson preparation, the building background, comprehensible input, strategies, interaction, practice, application, lesson delivery, review, and assessment. Teachers integrate these components into their lesson plans. So it would be a very well thought out lesson plan that includes all of these to target teaching the kids a second language. And I know we saw this with Dr. Milk, the SIOP, when in our undergrads, we in our biliteracy courses we would see I remember seeing the SIOP. Krashen's theory of second language acquisition suggests that people acquired a second language in a natural order when they receive comprehensible input and have a low affective filter. People can use learned knowledge of a language to monitor their output. So it consists of 5 interrelated hypotheses: the learning acquisition hypothesis, the natural order hypothesis, monitor hypothesis, the input hypothesis, and the affective filter hypothesis. So we're going to see how these hypotheses can help us like understand how the kids learn, and that way we can implement it in our teaching practices, which is the whole point of this chapter. So again, they talk about learning hypothesis and acquisition hypothesis. So learning, similar to a high school, college foreign language class. Learning is a conscious process that involves studying rules and vocabulary. And over here you see it's subconscious. Students may be unaware that they are picking up vocabulary or sentence structures. Language is broken down into manageable chunks, memorizing and practicing the different part of language. And over here occurs as the students use the language for a variety of purposes. Goal is to use language to communicate. This might include students studying vocabulary, verb conjugations, and practice using them in class with different exercise drills, and finally be testing on them. Over here, it happens in and out of school. Acquisition is what happens when someone goes to another country and picks up the language in the process of living and interacting with native speakers of the language. So as you can see, this one's more drill, more breaking down into chunks, and this one is like unconsciously you're learning, but not really unconsciously, but you do it through an activity where you're exercising the language more naturally. Okay, Krashen's theory of second language acquisition. So we continue. It's going to talk about these hypotheses. The natural order, like the name, it has to do with an order. Some aspects of language appear in speech of the language learners before other features. So certain morphemes or part of the language are developed before developing. I know when they talk about it's like the p, the those are ones that children usually develop before, and the vowels. Second language acquisition also has a natural order. An order of acquisition is the same even for children whose first language are different. Order depends on the language being acquired, not on the transfer features from the first language. The monitor hypothesis, like its name, it talks about monitoring, helps explain the roles of learning in the process of language acquisition. Acquisition is what enables native English speakers to tell what sounds right. The rules that people learn can be used to monitor spoken or written output. Optimum uses of the monitor involves checking to avoid major errors while keeping the focus on the message. Spoken language is more difficult to monitor than written language. Writers monitor during editing. However, writers monitor while they are drafting. The focus on form may interrupt the flow of their ideas. So it's just you monitor when the kids write, they're able to have that edit part because it's on paper, it's slower, but when you're talking, it's like you have to be monitoring but also making sure that you're giving the message, right? I'm saying it correctly, but I'm also giving the correct message. Input, again, like the title, what they give you. The key is comprehensible input, one that they can understand. Input that is slightly beyond their current level, not too low, not on level, or way above their level. And this is because they're like, if it's too low, they're not going to gain anything. If it's just on level, they're going to understand it, but they're still not going to learn anymore. And if it's way too above their level, but they're not going to understand anything. So as long as students understand most of what they hear or read, they will acquire the language. To ensure input is comprehensible, teachers can use pictures, gestures, tone of voice, and hands-on activities. Avoid using idioms, slowing down, pausing, and recycling vocabulary by planning curriculum around themes. So you're not supposed to, the only one that you're supposed to avoid is the idioms, but for purposes of space. But it's recommended that you slow down or pause, like to make sure that they're understanding, that they're giving them processing time. Recycling vocabulary by planning curriculum around themes. So if you were to do, I'm going to do everything on La Selva. So my language arts is going to have to do something with Selva, my science with Selva, my social studies, maybe let's study about South America. So you do it around a theme. That way, kind of the same vocabulary is being used across contents. Effective filter hypothesis. Input has to reach the part of the brain that processes language. Boredom and anxiety are effective factors that can act as a kind of filter to block incoming messages and prevent them from triggering acquisition. Students cannot acquire a language that never reaches the acquisition device. Singing and hands-on activities are examples of activities in which they can be engaged and more relaxed to acquire the second language. So, effective filter has to do with the feelings, with how they feel. So, if they feel bored or anxious, that's going to block them from learning the language, from that comprehensible input reaching the part of the brain where language is developed. Okay, the role of output, again, like the title, output, what you're putting out, credits the process of acquisition to learners' attempt at actually producing the language. Interaction hypotheses by Long claims that learners make conversational adjustments as they interact with others and that these adjustments help make the input they receive more comprehensible. Places more emphasis on the interaction that takes place in two-way communication and the adjustments that are made as a result of negotiation of meaning. Receiving input focuses on semantics and producing output on syntax. Recognizes the importance of input but also output. And then we have Krashen, which we were talking about before. And he says that the evidence is too weak. But basically, Long talks about how, when you're trying to negotiate meaning, you're outputting language. So your brain is what they input, the comprehensible input is making more sense to me as I also output. The teacher's not just telling me something, but I also have to use it. And then they say receiving input focus on semantics on the meaning, producing output more on like the way that you phrase things, like you word things. So they focus on two different cues. Schumann's theory of second language acquisition considers the broader social context. Social distance limits opportunities for students to receive comprehensible input needed for acquisition. Greater when there is only limited integration of the two cultural groups, minority groups itself large enough to be self-sufficient, the group is very tight-knit. Majority groups has a negative attitude toward minority groups. The learner only intends to stay a short period of time in a country. So these social distance limits are things that can affect, that the comprehensible input is working, but has to do more with like society. Psychological distance serves to raise the effective filter and prevent input from producing. So this one has to do more with us psychologically, like motivation, attitude, and culture shock. Schumann's theory of second language acquisition. 3 steps to help a person acquire a language: join a group and act like you know what is going on even if you don't. Give the impression with a few well-chosen words that you can speak the language. Count on your friends for help. So just go with the flow, like, I know the language. Programs continue to be developed contrary to current research and separate emergent bilinguals from native English speakers. Students are taught grammar, pronunciation, and vocabulary directly. Many middle and high school students are segregated from native English speakers and fail to develop the academic English required for school success. So even though we just saw this research, that they're supposed to be together and stuff, many programs continue to just teach English as a second language, apart from teaching it through content, or separate them from other students that are native speakers, which really helps. I've gotten to teach both. We call them one way, two way, and I see how the The one way the Spanish, they struggle to acquire that English because it's just like it would be good if they had a model. I could place them with a bilingual parent, help each other. The critical period hypothesis seeks to answer whether there is a critical or sensitive point in which it's easier to develop both a first or second language. Applies primarily to pronunciation, compares how children appear to be better language learners than adults. Generally, this critical period is put around birth to 6 years of age. So I think a lot of us have heard this, and we've seen it that for some reason children learn the the language better than the adults. And here there is some theories why they think this might be happening. Some hypotheses. Adult language learning. Adults are expected to have a much more developed vocabulary and their syntax is more complex. Nobody expects this from a 6-year-old. Less time to learn and they have to get to working. Children have fewer responsibilities. Often socialize with people who speak their same language, like outside of work. And then the kids many more chances to interact with children who speak the same language. Okay, the critical period hypothesis. We're still talking about the same hypothesis that children learn more easily than adults. So, even though adults are good language learners, they usually retain an accent. Below are the 3 most common explanations as to why most adults speak a second language with a foreign accent. So we have the neurological, the cognitive, and the affective. So this one has to do with the brain. Different functions develop on different areas of the brain. Intellectual, logical, and analytic in the left. Emotional and social in the right. By puberty, the different functions of the brain have been lateralized to the 2 hemispheres. Children who acquire a second language before puberty usually speak without an accent. Researchers hypothesize people are no longer able to acquire some aspects of language, such as phonology, once the brain is lateralized. So it has to do with the way that our brain develops. Then we have the cognitive factors, which have to do with Paget's formal operational stage. So, which it happens around the 11 years old. They develop. Younger children in the concrete operational stage may be able to acquire language without needing to analyze the structure of the language. So they don't really analyze it a lot. I'm learning it, I'm talking it, me aviento a hablarlo sin analizar mucho. Suena bien, suena mal. Older learners may not be able to suppress formal thought process. So as older, you get to analyze things in another way, and that maybe they overthink it. Younger children learn through acquisition. Older learners use cognitive processes to analyze language. As a result, have more difficult acquiring. So I thought this was very interesting. Affective factors. Older learners may be more self-conscious. Also, be hesitant to try in fear of appearing incompetent. Each person may have a language ego. Language forms an important part of the person's identity. By retaining an accent, a person keeps part of his identity. Few people who develop second language without accent, older people, and maybe because they admire and identify with people who live in a country where the language is spoken. Fossilization, the presence of certain kinds of errors that persist in the speech of adult second language errors. Errors may seem to have become permanent part of their new language. Many times learners are highly educated and have lived long in the country where the language is spoken. Instruction doesn't seem to solve the problematic characteristics of many older people who have acquired a second language. Perhaps the best explanation is that people have acquired enough of the language to communicate an idea. At a subconscious level, they may feel that their language is good enough. So I think we see a lot of, in this case, we see a lot of professors in college that they speak the language and it doesn't sound, as a native English speaker. But they're just very smart people, and they've written all these papers. They're college professors, and they know their content very well and everything. But it's just like for some reason, I guess like it says right here, they may feel that their English is good enough, and they continue to commit errors. Like it just, even if they give them instructions, that's good enough to convey meaning. 2 views of reading development. Similar to language acquisition, there's a debate over learned or acquisition methods for reading. Learn methods break tasks into component parts and teach each part. Acquisition methods begin by reading to and writing for children. And I'm so sorry about my cough, guys. I'm recovering from like a 3-day fever and losing my voice and everything. So, learning view of reading and acquisition view of reading. Again, this chapter talked about second language acquisition and about the development of writing. So again, it's going back to the learning and acquisition. Learning is more systematic, acquisition is more like natural. Instruction starts with the smallest parts and builds up to the whole. Students are taught phonological and phonemic awareness, letter names and sounds. Over here, instruction focuses on meaning construction through the use of background knowledge and cues from three systems: the semantic, the syntactic. Teachers teach phonics, rules, sight words, and structural analysis to identify words. Teachers follow a gradual release of responsibility model, which includes read alouds, shared and guided reading, and independent reader. Here on the learning, they use decodable and leveled books. Teachers use a variety of texts representing different genres. Students choose text to read. Students read aloud in round robin style and teacher corrects. Students read a variety of texts silently using comprehension strategies they have been taught. So those are the two views of reading, and now we're going to have two views of writing, written language development. From a learning point of view, writing must be taught directly. From an acquisition perspective, writing is acquired. Students use written language for real purposes. So, learning view of writing. Writing is broken down into component parts that are taught directly. Acquisition view of writing. Writing is acquired as children use writing for real purposes. So I guess when the broken parts, to me, learning view is like the bottom up, and then acquisition is top bottom. Here you start with the learning, you start parts like first letter name, letter sounds, then let's learn how to form a word, let's learn how to form sentences, paragraphs, etc. And over here it's more like let's just practice what we know, maybe like free write. And that's how they start becoming aware. Oh, there's words, oh, there's spaces. Teachers teach handwriting, letter formation of words, sentences, paragraphs, and whole text. Teachers follow gradual release model of language experience and share guided reading and independent reading. So we have the language experience, which that's what I presented my chapter on. And it's more like give them an experience, which is going to allow for them to use language, maybe a certain language you want them to use. Then as a class, the teacher acts as a scribe and they're dictating, they're telling you, and you're writing whatever they tell you. Teachers assign topics and correct students' writing. During writing workshops, students share their writing to learn to write drafts, conference, edit, and revise their work. The focus of writing instruction is on form. The focus of writing instruction is on both form and content. So over here form, over here content, the meaning part. So that is the end of my slideshow. I hope, at least for the chapter part, I hope that it helps you to understand how the different views of how second language can be taught or written language can be taught. Thank you for your time. Bye.